Hey guys, tonight we spend a day inside one of the most extraordinary cities ever built. Together. As we begin before the sun rises, before the markets open, before a single person steps into the street. In the year 730, in a city that may have held several 100,000 people, perhaps more, every day began with a drum. The sound moved outward from the palace, passing from ward to ward across the grid until the gates began to open and Chang'an came awake. This was a city built around order, its streets, its markets, its homes, even the hours in which people could move through them. And this morning, like every morning, the city was beginning again. This is Chang'an in the 8th century. And this is one day within it. Right now, as you're watching this, someone else is watching it too. A different country, a different time zone, a different life, but the same quiet hour. Tonight, we explore the City of Drums, together. If this is your first video here, take a look around, subscribe if it feels like home, and leave a comment. Your location, your time. That small act of saying, "I'm here," does something. It reminds all of us that we're not as alone in this as the dark sometimes makes us feel. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself if there's one nearby. Let's begin. Before we follow anyone through the streets of Chang'an, we need to understand what kind of city it was. Because Chang'an was unlike anything else in the 8th century world. Most cities of that era grew the way organic things grow, outward from a center, following rivers and roads and the paths that traders and animals had worn into the earth over generations. They were irregular, accidental, shaped by the logic of water and commerce and time. Chang'an was different. It had been designed. The city was laid out on a perfect grid, a rectangle of roughly 10 kilometers east to west and 8 kilometers north to south, subdivided into residential wards, each one a walled enclosure with its own gates. The two great markets, the eastern and the western, sat in symmetrical positions within the grid. The imperial palace complex occupied the northern edge, elevated slightly above the city it overlooked. Archaeologists and historical records together give us a reasonably clear picture of this layout. The grid was real. The walls were real. The symmetry was real. And the gates of each ward were locked at night. This is the detail that shapes everything else about a day in Chang'an. The city did not simply suggest order, it enforced it. At the sound of the evening drum, the ward gates closed. Anyone found outside their ward without authorization after that was in violation of the law. Tang records document the enforcement, the night patrols, the penalties. The night was for staying where you were. And so the city lay organized and still in the hours before dawn, its hundreds of thousands of residents within their assigned quarters, the streets empty, the market stalls dark, the canal running quietly through the lower wards with no one to hear it. In a room in the scholars' quarter, one of the wards near the eastern part of the city, where men who had come to Chang'an to study and sit examinations rented modest accommodation, a lamp was still burning. Someone had been awake before the drum. He is not a historical person. He is a representative figure, the kind of man that Tang records, poetry, and social history give us very clearly. An aspiring official. A man who had passed the preliminary levels of the imperial examination system and was working toward the highest degree, the Jinshe, which would qualify him for meaningful government service.
He is our viewpoint for this day, not because we know who he was, but because we know, from Tang sources, what his world looked like and how he moved through it. The lamp in his room burned low. Outside, through the narrow gap in the ward gate, the street was completely dark and completely quiet. He had been studying, practice essays, classical texts. The examination did not test only knowledge, it tested the ability to compose formal prose and verse in prescribed styles, demonstrating not just what a candidate had read, but how completely he had absorbed the classical tradition. Men studied for this their entire adult lives. Tang poetry is full of the examination, the anxiety of it, the years of preparation, the reality that many men who sat it multiple times never passed. It was not simply a test, it was the organizing principle of an educated man's existence. He set down his brush. Outside, the city was still dark, and then, from the north, the drum. The Tang drum system is documented in the official histories and in the records of the city's administration. The morning drum sounded from the palace, the Da Ming Palace, which sat on a raised platform at the northern edge of Chang'an, visible from most of the city on clear days. From there, the signal was picked up and relayed outward across the wards. The exact mechanics are not fully reconstructed. We know drums were used to regulate the city's rhythms. We know the ward gates were controlled by this system. We know that the morning and evening drums marked the opening and closing of the day. What we can say with confidence is the effect. Across Chang'an, the ward gates began to open. Not all at once. The signal had to travel, and the city was large. But within minutes of the first drum from the palace, the sound was moving through the grid, and the gates were responding, and the streets that had been empty were beginning to receive the first movement of the day. Imagine standing at the end of a long, straight street in the pre-dawn grey. The ward gate at the far end is closed, solid wood fitted into its stone frame. And then the drum reaches this ward, and the gate opens, and through it, faintly at first, then more clearly, comes the sound of the city beginning on the other side. Vendors calling to each other, the creak of a cart, the smell of something cooking carried on the morning air. The day has started. But the morning did not simply begin. It was organized. And what was organized revealed everything about how Tang Chang'an understood time itself. He stepped out of the ward gate into the street. The street was wide. Tang Chang'an's main avenues were substantial, designed for the movement of significant numbers of people and goods. Dust in dry weather, mud in wet. The smell in the morning, according to the evidence of Tang poetry and records, was a mixture of things. The particular earthiness of a city of this size, charcoal smoke from the cooking fires being lit in houses throughout the ward, the first smells of food. Sesame cakes. These are documented vendors sold them in the streets and markets of Tang Chang'an, a cheap and portable breakfast food that appears in records and poetry. They were baked on a griddle, sesame-coated, warm. The morning food culture of the Tang capital drew on a remarkable range of traditions. Millet porridge was common. Noodles, which had been part of Chinese cuisine for centuries by this point, were sold in shops. Lamb appeared regularly in the city's food culture, reflecting the strong northern and Central Asian influences on Tang cooking, particularly in the capital. He walked north. The streets were filling.
The rhythm of a Tang morning is documented well enough to reconstruct in broad strokes the movement of people toward their day's work, the vendors establishing themselves, the sound of the city accumulating from silence into noise. The canal was audible before it was visible. Chang'an had an extensive water system, channels and canals that brought water into the city from the rivers and reservoirs to the south and east. The sound of running water in a city of this size was a constant presence. Water carriers worked the streets. The larger canals moved goods, boats arriving with supplies from the surrounding region, unloading at points along the waterway. He crossed the bridge over one of the smaller channels. Below him, the water moved steadily east, carrying a raft of reeds toward the market. Before we go further into the day, I want to invite you to stop. Imagine standing at the center of a wide, empty street in Chang'an, just after the morning drum. The street runs perfectly straight from where you stand to a gate at the far end, perhaps half a kilometer. On either side, the walls of the residential wards. Above, the sky lightening from grey to pale blue. From every direction, just audible, the sound of the city starting. Not noise yet, not the full sound of the day, just the first indications. A voice, a wheel, water running somewhere, the faint smell of something cooking. The sun is not yet above the walls. The street is still mostly shadow, and yet the city is already in motion. Take a slow breath. Rest in that image. The government office he walked toward was one of many administrative buildings distributed through the city. Tang governance required substantial bureaucratic infrastructure, and that infrastructure had a physical presence in the daily life of the capital. The clerk, as we will call him for simplicity, was not yet a senior official. He occupied one of the lower rungs of the administrative hierarchy, a position that required his presence, his brush, his meticulous attention to documents. Tang bureaucracy was extensive and document-heavy. Official records, land registers, tax documents, imperial decrees, local petitions. All of these required drafting, copying, checking, stamping with the appropriate seals. The Chinese bureaucratic tradition had developed over centuries a system of documentation that was, by the standards of the 8th century, extraordinarily sophisticated. For the clerk, the morning meant documents. He sat at his desk in a room with other men of similar rank, his brush loaded with ink, working through a stack of official correspondence that needed to be copied in the correct formal style. The copying was not mechanical. It required judgment about format, about the appropriate level of formality for each document, about the correct use of official terminology. The examination he was working toward tested exactly these skills. Formal prose composition, the ability to write in prescribed styles, the classical knowledge that underpinned the entire administrative vocabulary. The connection between the examination and the actual work of governance was direct, not always in the specific content tested, which leaned heavily on the classical literary tradition, but in the habits of mind that years of study produced. Precision, attention to form, the understanding that the wrong character in the wrong place had consequences. The examination system also had significant limitations, which Tang writers themselves acknowledged. It rewarded a specific kind of knowledge, classical literacy, that families with resources could cultivate more effectively than families without them. Access to good teachers and study materials was not equally distributed.
The system was not simply a ladder of pure merit, and Tang records show awareness of this tension. He worked until mid-morning. When he put down his brush, his fingers were ink-stained. He was heading to the market. And the eastern market of Chang'an was not simply a place to buy things. It was a condensed version of the world as the Tang knew it. The two great markets of Chang'an, the eastern market and the western market, were walled enclosures within the city grid, each one a substantial space subdivided into lanes organized by trade type. The eastern market served primarily the eastern residential wards, where the official class and wealthy families were concentrated. The western market, closer to the foreign merchant quarter, was more internationally diverse. Sogdian merchants, Persian traders, merchants from across Central Asia maintained stalls and warehouses there. The markets opened and closed by drum, like the ward gates. Records document the opening time as fixed. Trade could not begin before the signal, and violating market regulations carried penalties. Within the Eastern market, what existed was the material reality of the Tang Empire's connections with the wider world. Silk, of course. Silk was the foundational commodity of the Tang economy, not simply a luxury item, but a form of currency, used in official payments and in trade along the routes that connected Chang'an to Central Asia and beyond. The quality of silk varied enormously. The finest grades carried with them a kind of value that modern equivalents can barely approximate. They were functional, beautiful, and economically significant simultaneously. But beside the silk, medicines. Tang medical knowledge drew on traditions from across the empire and beyond. Pharmacies in the market offered ingredients documented in Tang medical texts, some familiar, some that reflected the incorporation of Central Asian, Indian, and other medical traditions into Chinese practice. Glazed ceramics. The Tang produced pottery of extraordinary quality, the famous Tang Sansai, three-color glazed ware in warm amber and green and cream. Objects that survive in museums today give a direct visual connection to what the market stalls of Chang'an displayed. And sounds, not just Chinese. Tang records, poetry, and the accounts of foreign visitors document the linguistic variety of the Chang'an markets. Sogdian merchants from Central Asia, whose community in Chang'an is very well documented, conducted business in their own language alongside Chinese. Merchants from further west communicated through interpreters. The market had a sonic texture that reflected the reach of the Silk Road. He bought sesame oil for his lamp and ink. The examination season was coming. There is something worth pausing on here. The markets of Tang Chang'an were not simply commercial spaces. They were the physical evidence of what the Tang Empire had achieved, not only militarily or politically, but in terms of connectivity. The goods in those stalls had traveled months to arrive. The merchants who sold them had crossed deserts and mountain passes. The objects themselves, the glassware, the spices, the dyed textiles, carried within them the accumulated distances of the Silk Road. For a young official working his way through Tang bureaucracy, the market was also a reminder of the scale of what he was working within. The Tang state was vast, and it functioned because of people like him. The men who copied the documents, who applied the seals, who kept the administrative machinery running day after day. The ink he carried home would go toward both, the lamp and the examination papers. Near the market, in the wealthier wards of the eastern city, tea houses had begun to appear. Tea drinking was present in Tang China,
but was in a period of significant cultural development. The classic of tea, Lu Yu's foundational text on the practice, was being written around this very period, which means the culture of tea in 730 CE was real, but still finding its forms. What the clerk drank in a tea house in 730 CE was tea, the plant steeped in water, but the precise rituals and aesthetic frameworks that would later become formalized were at this moment still emerging. The tea house he entered was a gathering place for men of his class and aspiration. This is documented in Tang sources as a real social institution. Educated men gathered, drank, and composed poetry together, not as occasional recreation, but as a regular social practice, with its own expectations and conventions. Poetry in Tang China was not simply an art form, it was a social technology. A Tang official was expected to be able to compose verse on demand, in response to a scene or a sentiment or a social occasion. The ability to produce a competent, or better yet, a memorable poem in the moment was a measure of cultivation and intelligence. It was performed socially, shared aloud, commented on by others. Tang poetry is, as a result, both extraordinarily abundant and extraordinarily high in quality, because the social pressure to be good at it was real and constant. At the gathering he attended, a theme was proposed: the approaching summer, the examination season, the sound of the morning drum heard from a scholar's room. Men composed. The verses were shared. We do not know what he wrote, but we know the form the gathering took because Tang poetry and social records document it clearly. The anxiety underneath the elegance was real. A man whose verse was flat or formulaic in this company would be noticed. Poetry was not just expression. It was, in a meaningful sense, proof. He composed something. He shared it. The room moved on. Before the afternoon, I want to invite you to stop again. Imagine sitting in a tea house in Chang'an near the end of the morning gathering. The room is not large. There are perhaps a dozen men. The cups on the low tables hold tea, slightly bitter, warm, unfamiliar in the way of something that has not yet settled into its final form as a cultural practice. Outside, through the latticed screen, the street sounds of the market nearby. Someone has just finished reciting a poem. The room is quiet for a moment, the way rooms go quiet after something that was well made. Then conversation resumes. You don't understand the words, but you understand the quality of the silence before the conversation returned. That silence, the one that follows something good, is the same in every language. Take a breath. He walked to the temple in the early afternoon. Buddhism in Tang Chang'an was not a minority practice or an exotic import. It had been present in China for centuries by 730 CE and was deeply integrated into the daily life of the capital. The great Tang temples were significant architectural and cultural institutions, places of genuine religious practice, of scholarship, of daily life. The religious landscape of Tang Chang'an was, in fact, considerably more complex than any single tradition. Most Tang people of this period did not identify exclusively with Buddhism, or with Taoism, or with the Confucian ethical tradition. These frameworks coexisted in daily practice. A man might visit a Buddhist temple in the afternoon and consult a Taoist text in the evening and organize his official conduct around Confucian principles without experiencing contradiction.
Tang religious life was, by the evidence of its texts and material remains, pluralistic in daily practice, even when official ideology emphasized certain traditions over others. The city also contained, this is well documented, places of worship for communities that practiced other traditions entirely. Nestorian Christian communities had a church in Chang'an. Zoroastrian communities maintained fire temples. The degree to which these communities were tolerated varied over the course of the Tang Dynasty, but in the period around 730 CE, under the reign of Xuanzong, foreign religious practice had considerable room to exist. The temple he visited was a Buddhist institution, one of the many that Tang records and archaeology document within the city. Inside, the smell of incense, the sound of chanting from the monks' quarters, barely audible. The visual richness of Tang Buddhist art, the painted and gilded imagery that Tang temple interiors contained, of which enough survives in various forms to give us a reasonable picture. He sat and copied sutras. This was a practice, documented extensively in Tang's sources, that was simultaneously devotional and meditative. Copying sacred texts required slow, careful attention. This was a practice, documented extensively in Tang sources, that was simultaneously devotional and meditative. Copying sacred texts required slow, careful attention. It produced a kind of focused quiet that the examination-seasoned mind, full of anxiety and preparation, perhaps needed. The afternoon light came through the paper screens at an angle. Outside, the city continued. From the upper level of a pagoda nearby, not necessarily from the Wild Goose Pagoda specifically, but from one of the several significant pagodas within Tang Chang'an, the city was visible in a way it was not from the street. The grid. The Tang urban grid, seen from any height above street level, resolved into its true character, the geometrical precision of a city built to a plan. The long, straight avenues running north-south and east-west, the ward walls creating blocks of regular size, the markets, the palace to the north. Historical records and the accounts of visitors to Tang Chang'an describe the city's order in terms that suggest this visual character was not simply an administrative fact, but something that residents and visitors actually experienced and remarked upon. A city this organized, seen from above, communicated something about the civilization that built it. That order was not accidental. It was chosen. In the afternoon, the gardens near the southern wards were busy. The Tang cultural relationship with the peony is very well documented. It is perhaps the single most consistent theme in Tang poetry after love, examinations, and moonlight. The flower was cultivated, prized, discussed, traded, and mourned when the season ended. Tang poets write about peonies with an intensity that can seem almost excessive until you understand what the flower represented. Not simply beauty, but the intersection of natural beauty and human cultivation. The peony did not grow wild in Chang'an. It was planted, tended, bred for particular characteristics. The finest specimens were the product of expertise and care over years. This made the peony a resonant symbol for Tang-educated culture, beauty that required cultivation. The gardens where peonies were displayed in the flowering season attracted people of all social classes. This is documented in Tang poetry, which describes the gardens as crowded. Officials and merchants and craftsmen and farmers who had come into the city, all present in the same space, looking at the same flowers. The social mixing of the garden was unusual in a city as stratified as Chang'an. For a brief afternoon in late spring, the order of the grid, gave way to something looser. He stood in front of a bank of red and white blooms. A merchant stood nearby, from the look of his clothing a man of some wealth, but not official rank. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The flowers were simply there, extravagantly present, their smell heavy in the afternoon air. Let's stay in the garden for a moment. Imagine a late spring afternoon in Chang'an. The sun is beginning to lower toward the western walls. The light is warm and slightly golden. Around you, the peony beds are in full flower, red and white, and a deep purplish pink that Tang breeders had worked for years to produce. The garden is full of people. Not a crowd in the anxious sense, just the ordinary gathering of a city that has been organized and efficient all day, pausing in one place to look at something beautiful together. The smell is almost too much. Someone nearby is reciting a poem quietly, almost to themselves. You cannot make out the words, but the sound of a person quietly reciting something they love in a garden full of flowers in the late afternoon of a well-ordered day, that needs no translation. Breathe slowly. Let the afternoon light be what it is. The market closing drum sounded in the late afternoon. This was as documented and regulated as the morning opening, the drum that ended the trading day, after which the stalls were closed and the market lanes cleared. Tang records are clear that the markets operated within strict time boundaries. For the vendors, the closing drum meant packing, the physical labor of disassembling a market stall, rolling the silk, boxing the medicines, loading the remaining ceramics carefully onto carts, happened quickly, because the evening ward gates would follow. He walked back through the market as the stalls were closing. The market in this state, half-packed, the lanes still full of movement, but the commercial energy gone out of them, had a specific quality that is almost impossible to reconstruct precisely, but is easily imagined. The day's trade had happened. Whatever had been sold had been sold. Whatever hadn't, hadn't. He bought noodles from a shop near the market edge. Tang noodle shops had documented the noodle tradition in China predates the Tang considerably, and by the 8th century, noodle making was a practiced and varied craft. The shop he stopped at would have been a simple space, serving a limited range of dishes to a steady stream of customers. He ate standing or sitting on a low bench. The bowl was returned. The transaction was ordinary. But as he walked back toward his ward in the growing dusk, he was aware of something that every resident of Chang'an was aware of at this hour. The ward gates were going to close, and everyone who intended to be somewhere different tonight needed to be there now. The evening curfew was real and enforced. Tang records document the night patrol system officials responsible for enforcing the curfew, with authority to detain anyone found outside their ward without authorization. This was not merely a technical regulation. It shaped the entire rhythm of the day. Every social engagement, every errand, every journey to another part of the city had to be accomplished before the evening drum. The effect of this on daily life was to concentrate the day's activity into the hours between the morning and evening drums, to give the day a shape that was not simply biological, but institutional. The day had a beginning enforced by drums, and an end enforced by the same mechanism. He reached his ward gate as the evening light was still warm. He passed through. Behind him, the gate closed. The room was quiet. His lamp was refilled with sesame oil from the morning market. The flame was small and steady. Outside, the ward was settling into its nighttime character. Occasional sounds, the movement of residents within the walls, but nothing from the streets beyond. He opened his texts. the examination season. The classical tradition he was working to demonstrate mastery of, the prose styles and poetic forms that the examination required. Elsewhere in Chang'an, in the wards designated for foreign merchants and travelers, different lamps were burning. The Sogdian and Persian merchant communities documented in Tang records maintained their own quarters, their own social networks, their own commercial and religious practices. A merchant from these communities, in his lodgings after the evening drum, might have been writing letters home were real, though the routes they traveled and the time they took make the process almost incomprehensible to modern experience. A letter sent from Chang'an to Persia in 730 CE traveled along the Silk Road, through a series of intermediaries over a period that could be measured in months or longer. We do not know what he wrote, but the act of writing by lamplight in a locked ward in a city of hundreds of thousands of people who were all similarly contained within their quarters for the night is documented enough to imagine without invention. The city was quiet, not silent. The sounds of a large settlement at night are their own kind of noise, but the specific quality of Chang'an at night within the grid was organized quiet. The curfew had done its work. The ward gates were closed. The drum that had started the day was already waiting to start the next one. I want to speak slowly now to whoever is still listening. What Chang'an was in 730 CE was a particular kind of human experiment. The experiment was this: that a very large number of people, organized by a very deliberate set of rules, the grid, the wards, the drums, the examination system, the market regulations, the curfew, could produce something that neither the rules nor the people could produce alone. The city, not just as a physical fact, but as a cultural one. The poetry that was composed in the tea houses of Chang'an has survived for 13 centuries. The glazed ceramics produced in the workshops of the Tang capital sit in museums across the world. The administrative systems developed in the government offices, tested and refined and passed through the examination system, influenced governance across East Asia for a millennium and more. Japanese scholars came to Chang'an specifically to copy what they found here. Korean diplomats, Sogdian merchants, Tibetan representatives, all of them came because Chang'an in 730 CE was producing something that the world recognized as worth understanding. And at the center of all of it, the clerk with ink-stained fingers, the merchants in their quarter, the monks in the temple, the vendors packing their stalls, was a city that had decided to organize its day by drum. The drum in the morning saying, "Begin." The drum in the evening saying, "Stop." And in between, within the order that the drums created, a day. One specific, unrepeatable, ordinary, extraordinary day. Tonight, wherever you are, let the drums have done their work. The ward gate is closed. The examination papers are set aside. The lamp is burning low. Let the city sleep. Let your breathing slow. Let the long straight avenues of Chang'an run into the dark behind your eyes. The ward walls on either side, the palace lit to the north, the canal running quietly somewhere to the south. The city is organized and still, and somewhere in it, a lamp is burning lower and lower, and then not at all. Rest now. The drum will sound in the morning.
If this reached you tonight, leave a comment, just your city and the time. And if this story found you at the right moment, tell me. Those comments are the reason this channel exists. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. We're here every Tuesday, Thursday and Sunday. Same quiet place, same honest voice. Good night, wherever you are.